China's economy is a house of cards. It's not my view. It's what economist Gary Shilling says. Gary often finds himself a lonely contrarian, and almost as often he ends up being right. Like when he said back in 1988 that Japan, then at the height of its economic power, was poised for a deflationary depression. Back then, that was heresy. Today, we all know about the lost decade. Gary is with me here in New York. Gary, great to have you back. Let's talk, though, about this. China, a house of cards. We've heard people like Jim Chanos, a short seller, talk about China in the midst of a real estate bubble. He's skeptical of the figures that China releases on its economy. What's your take?
Well, you can't trust the numbers. What's fascinating is that China manages to get their GDP numbers out 21 days after the close of the quarter. It takes the U.S. 29 days. We take another week, and I think we got a little bit better data collection efforts. I mean, I think they gin up the numbers whatever the leaders want over there, so you can't trust them. But China, I think they have kick-started their economy in the last year. It's a stop-go economy, and they can do it fast. You know, they don't have to worry about EPA audits or anything like that. They just let the bulldozers roll when they want to build a new road or whatever. The point is, though, they build an awful lot of excess capacity, and the question is, how are they going to use it? Because American consumers aren't buying their exports the way they used to, and their domestic economy isn't that strong, so they got a lot of excess capacity.
Well, people won't argue with you that the domestic spending in China is not where it might be, but some people may take issue with your view, which is to say the capacity that the Chinese are installing will get soaked up by Chinese domestic demand that is growing. I take it you don't see it that way.
Well, it's growing, but it's growing from a small base. Their consumer spending is 36% of GDP, and it's a declining share over the last 2 decades. In the U.S., it's 71% of GDP. They are still very much dependent on exports. Their exports are 38% of GDP. Ours are 12%. They really don't have a big enough middle class of people with discretionary spending. We did a study back in November of 2007 when people then thought China was decoupled from the rest of the world, and determined there were 110 million people with over $5,000 per capita income, enough to give them discretionary spending, but that was only 8% of the population. In this country, it's 80% of the population. So they're growing, but they're not far enough along the path of industrialization to have that middle class to do the job.
Gary, we've got about 45 seconds before we need to take a short break. You're going to be sticking with us, but let's ask this question. Everybody is concerned about the yuan. How do your views on the Chinese economy influence, or at least how do they translate into your thinking on the yuan?
Well, if they took off all the controls and Chinese could invest abroad, the yuan would probably go down because people will want to diversify. All they can do now is put their money in banks, and they get a negative real interest rate. And other than that, it's real estate or stocks, and the government isn't happy about speculation in either of those.
I want to stop you right there because we have about 20 seconds left. You're arguing that if anything, the Chinese yuan would go down if they removed controls that everybody else thinks would allow it to appreciate.
That's right. And I think the political leaders are aware of that possibility. They sure don't want to be pushed around, and I think Obama made a huge mistake in trying to push them again. Remember that China was dominated by Europeans in the last century, and they want to run their own country.